Let's go. Well, welcome everyone. Tonight is our seminar on the super budgeting process, and I'm so glad you could be with us tonight. We're all happy that it's raining out there in San Antonio. Houston, you've had plenty of rain, but it's a beautiful evening to be inside and listening to a super budget webinar. This is the 7th seminar that we've done as a webcast, and if you have not seen any of the prior ones, feel free to visit our website, and on the library page you can have, there's a link to each of the seminars that we've done this year so far. They're also on YouTube, and you can probably search and find them. What I'd like to do is, as we do always, is encourage you to ask questions through the chat box. And I have an assistant here who's going to be helping this evening. This is Brandy Brack. She is one of our community managers at our San Antonio office, and she is going to be answering some of the questions that you chat in, and others she'll ask me to answer. So please, if I ever say anything that is a question for you, please go ahead and chat a question, and I'll see if I can clarify things for you. So, Brandy, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, let's go ahead and get started. We've got a lot of great things to talk about this evening in this particular seminar. We're in the budget season, and one thing C.I.A. Services does in preparing budgets for all of our communities is we have a really special model that we use, and we refer to it as our super budget. I'll define that in a moment. But what we are going to go through now are, we're going to start with some questions. And at the very end of the seminar, we're going to answer those questions. And those are really key, important questions. We'll talk about what super budgeting is. We'll go ahead and touch on the concepts of funds. And funds are what drives a super budget versus other types of budgets. We'll go through what some of the calculations are, and we'll look at a full, complete super budget and what the components are. Some of you may have already received a draft of your 2018 budgets. Several have already been approved. Others will be seeing them over the next month or month and a half. And so this is really, really useful for you to understand that big package that we give to you. Let's go ahead and start with the questions. And so the best way to think about these questions is to think about you being at an annual meeting. So you're at an annual meeting, and it's maybe in the open forum portion. Maybe the financial report has just been given. And then a homeowner raises their hand and stands up and says very politely, "What's the right assessment for our community?" They may ask, "How much money should we have in the bank?" Well, if you've ever been to an annual meeting, they probably weren't quite that polite. In many cases, they're indicating, "Why is our assessment so high?" And they always know a neighboring community with a lower assessment. "My friend over here, when I lived over there, the assessment was lower." So many times they're asking the questions in maybe a little more aggressive way. And how much should we have in the bank? Why do we have so much in the bank? Why don't you give the money back to us? That may be the way the question is phrased, but those questions, no matter how they're phrased, are very valid questions. And every board member ought to know how to answer it. Unfortunately, if that question were asked, and if you're the president, you're the presiding officer, and the person stands up and asks those aggressive questions, what's the right answer? Well, it's simple. If you're the president, you'll say, "I'm going to ask my treasurer to answer those questions." And then the treasurer will stand up and may be able to answer them, or may go on with an ad-lib answer such as, "Well, you can't compare our assessments to anyone else, and we need to have enough money in the bank for a rainy day," or whatever it might be. Well, you should be able to answer those very specifically, and you can. That's what super budgeting gives you. So our process to be able to accurately predict what the future financially will be for an association and what the financial needs are, that's the super budgeting process. So what is super budgeting? What distinguishes super budgeting from any other type of budgeting that you may be used to? Well, first of all, it's a comprehensive financial valuation of the association. It's not just how much we're going to pay for electricity this year and how much our pool contract's going to be, how much it's going to cost to mow the lawns, but we need to also look at long-term. We need to look at the assets we have, and someday they're going to wear out and we need to do something about it. We may have some goals for the community. We may want to create new things for the community, provide new services for the community. A super budget allows us to take into account all of the plans, all of the assets, short and long term, and determine how we get there financially. That's a super budget. You may have heard the terms reserve analysis. We'll see that quite a bit later on in tonight's webinar. But a reserve analysis is a critical component for doing this comprehensive evaluation. And our super budget model that we have has an integrated reserve analysis in it. You'll know more about what I'm saying in a few minutes. When we're looking into the future, we can't predict exactly what will happen. So what's important is that we make reasonable assumptions about everything from the cost of goods, the cost of services moving off into the future, what may be happening from an assessment standpoint, and things of that sort. So we make reasonable assumptions for every one of these particular lines that go into the super budget, and that's what gives us a good directional outlook of where we are going to be in the future. The end result is a package that is well documented, and I'm going to show you some examples in a minute. It's more than just numbers. There's a lot of words in our super budget package that helps a future board member or the management company or the current board members to understand what went into this budget, what went into every particular line item on the operating budget, what the assumptions were, what, for example, under the, if you have a social committee, what events are contemplated for the dollars that have been put aside. All of that is in the super budget package. Now, if you do proper planning and you utilize a super budget, then you don't have to worry about erratic changes in assessments. You don't have to worry about not being able to take care of the association assets when they wear out. You won't have to worry about special assessments. You won't have to worry about all of those things because the super budget will give you a look forward, and every single year you refine that as you're moving off into the future. So that's what a super budget is. Now, one of the words I've mentioned several times so far is reserves. And it's a word that we choose not to use when we're talking about super budgets. It's a perfectly appropriate word, but it's very confusing in the way it's often used. A reserve simply indicates funds that are set aside for a particular purpose. They're reserved for some use. Now, that's a proper definition. The problem is that when someone hears that, or when some people say that, they really have something different in mind. And so they may think, I've heard board members indicate that our reserves are what we have in the bank. So they look at the bank statement and they say that's what our reserves are. Or that someone may define reserves as the money we have put aside in case the clubhouse burns down. Well, maybe, but you probably have insurance for that particular purpose. It's the amount we've accumulated for a playground. Okay. Or the favorite one that's sometimes used is, it's what we put aside for a rainy day. Maybe a contingency fund might be a better way to describe that. So the reason we don't use the word reserves independently is because you set aside money for a particular purpose. We prefer to use the word funds. So a reserve fund for a particular purpose. And we'll get into what those are in a moment. And so, oh, did you actually see that little graphic there go across there? That's about as exciting as the animation goes in this presentation. So let's start by talking about super budget funds. We're going to talk about 4 different funds. The first one is an operating fund. Now, the purpose of an operating fund, and in all these reserve funds, we're going to have a reason we're putting the money aside. So for the operating fund, the reason we put it aside is to take care of fluctuations in our routine operating revenues or expenses versus what we budgeted. So we may, for example, have lower than expected collection rates, which means our funds are down. Or we may have higher utility bills this year versus what we budgeted, which means our funds are down. Likewise, it could go in the opposite direction. Our collection rate went from 98 to 99%. Our projections on a grounds maintenance contract increase didn't materialize and they kept the same rate. So in either case, the purpose of the operating fund is to take care of those fluctuations between what we budgeted and reality and allow us to absorb those fluctuations. That's the first fund, the operating fund. The second fund we'll talk about is the one that, if there's a fund that we normally think about, it's the replacement fund. The purpose of the replacement fund is to repair or replace the major physical assets of the association. What are physical assets of the association? Well, we might have a playground, we might have an entry monument, we might have a clubhouse, we might have a swimming pool, we might have a tennis court, we might have extensive landscaping, we might have splash pads, we might own the roads, we may have gates. All of those physical assets that we need to take care of that belong to the association or are maintained by the association are the assets that we are protecting with our replacement fund. And so we put the money aside such that when we need to take care of that asset, the money is there. Just like we all do for the roofs on our house. We all put money aside for 30 years or for 25 years so that we can pay for it in cash when it happens. Well, the reality is very few of us actually have our own super budgets, but the concept is the same. In your house, you need to replace a refrigerator every once in a while. You need to buy a new car. You need to fix a fence. All of those things. Wouldn't it be great if we were putting money aside specifically so that we could write a check each time for those things when it happens? So that's the second fund. We had the operating fund and the replacement fund. Let's move on to the third one. The third one is a capital fund. In the super budget model, a capital fund, its purpose is to create new assets that don't exist now. So for example, if we decide we want to put a new playground in on some vacant land that the association owns, and we want to put a little pocket park or a little playground there, that would be a capital fund expenditure. Or if we already have a playground, but we wanted to add a shade cover over the playground so that children wouldn't burn themselves going down the slide in the middle of August. If we have 2 entries, one of them doesn't have a monument, we want to add it. So a capital fund is needed when we want to or have plans to create new assets. I'll go into a little bit more detail in a moment. So we have operating fund, replacement fund, capital fund. The fourth of the funds are special purpose funds. So a special purpose fund can be any of the above. for a purpose of any of the above, but it is something that I'll define in a moment, where we've promised the people who gave us the money that we would use the money in a particular way. So maybe we have a special assessment where we bill all the owners money for a particular project to fix the roads or something else of that sort. That's a special purpose fund, and you can have multiple special purpose funds, but the bottom line is a special purpose fund is tied to a promise to the people you collected the money from. Let's go into these a little bit in a little bit more detail now that you know that we've got the four funds we're going to talk about. And let's start with the operating fund. Again, its purpose is to protect against fluctuations between what we thought we were going to receive or spend and what reality is when we actually are running through the year. And the 1980s, for the folks who were adults at that time, not Brandy, she is very young, but in the 1980s, we had kind of the worst combination of things that affected the operating funds of associations. Those who were living through that time know that we had very high inflation. And so the costs were going up faster than we would have expected. There was actually double-digit inflation in the early 1980s. We also, at that same time, after an oil embargo and some other various things, we had a lot of folks, especially in Texas, who were losing their jobs because of the downturn in the oil industry and how things were so tied to the oil industry, especially in the Houston area during that time. So we had a double whammy. We had prices going up potentially by double-digit inflation, and we had our revenues from the association dropping because people were losing their jobs and in many cases losing their homes. And so no matter what we may have guessed was going to occur, that was one of the worst times in terms of us being able to meet our budgets. Without an operating fund, there would have been no cushion for associations to deal with that. Now, you can say, well, prices go up, collections go down, we can just raise our assessments. That is one of the nice things about an association, is most associations have an ability to just raise the assessments by a vote of 3 or 5 people. It's not as though we need to, in most associations, go to the whole membership and say, can we raise the assessment by $1? But that is not an unlimited authority of the board of directors. Typically, the board can raise the assessments 3 or 5%, 10% is a very common number. But if you have double-digit inflation on the expense side, and you drop your collection rate from a 98% to a 92%, that's a swing of almost 20% in terms of what your expected net income was going to be. And if you can only go up once a year by 5% or 10%, you're not going to be able to absorb it. So, where should our operating fund be? You can actually calculate what that should be. I won't go right now into the reason or how we set that level, but for most associations, that is going to be in the range of 25 to 75% of your normal operating expenses. That's the cushion you're going to want. There used to be, a long time ago, people had a rule of thumb. How much should we have in, quote, reserves? And they'd say 3 to 6 months. Well, if you think of those particular numbers, 3 to 6 months happens to be 4 to 6, 3 to 6 months, 25 to 50% operating fund. We're saying it's 25 to 75%. At some point, if there's a question about how we set that level, I could answer that question. But again, the ideal value is about in the range of 25 to 75% of whatever your normal operating expenses are. And so there are a number of examples that are related to where an association needed to utilize an operating fund to get them through various things. So for example, wow, I remember again back in the 1980s when we had double-digit inflation, we could get 7 or 8% CDs. We're earning a lot of money on interest. Today, wow, if you get 1% on a CD, you found a bargain. And so if you were depending on that, that revenue source dried up. Way back in the 70s, there used to be something called cable franchise fee agreements, where cable companies didn't recognize that they could use utility easements and put their cables in there like other utility companies. And so they'd actually write contracts with associations, say, hey, if you let us come into your community, we'll pay you some money. And you know, communities, small communities were making $3,000 or $4,000 a year just on that. Well, those expired. The cable companies got smart and realized, hey, we can use utility easements. We don't need associations. And so those payments stopped. Electricity goes up and down. And so if you budgeted a small amount and it went up, how are you going to deal with that? You're not going to turn off monument lights and tennis lights and pool lights and things like that. You need to deal with it. The operating fund helps you. A couple communities listed on this slide, Quail Bridge is one of them, Pine Forest Village and several others, Oak Cliff Place, have at times encountered some crime issues. And they didn't have security in the community, but they encountered some crime issues. It wasn't budgeted to put any money towards security, but in order to deal with the issues of break-ins in cars or vandalism or things like that, they hired security. It was a short-term thing. The operating fund is what allowed them to do it. It wasn't budgeted. And so those are a couple examples of the operating fund. Before I move on to the replacement fund, we do have a question. Where's it from, Brandy?
It looks like we have a question out of San Antonio. It says, I'm not sure I understand the operating fund and how to determine the target level. Can you go over that?
Yes, I thought it was a longer question, so I took a drink. Absolutely. So how do we set that level? I said 25 to 75%. That's a pretty wide range. And in reality, we go lower. We have some communities that we recommend about 15%. We have some that we recommend 100%. And it really has to do with what the character of our operating revenues and expenses are. So if we have operating revenues that are mostly controllable, where in other words the board can make a decision and reduce expenses, or the board can make a decision and greatly increase assessments. So you've got a 15% ability to raise assessments, and the things that you pay for are contracts where you can cut the pool hours, you can reduce the amount of security. So in other words, if you have controllable revenues and expenses, you only need a smaller amount of an operating fund because you can rapidly adjust to changes and you have the ability to do that. If a community mostly has expenses that cannot be controlled and a small ability to raise their assessments, so you can only raise your assessments by 3%, and the majority of your costs are utility type costs and things of that sort, then those are the times you would need a larger operating fund target in order to be able to properly protect the association. So it really has to do with the board's authority to control their revenues and expenses is what puts it up or down. So great question. Thank you for asking. Let me move now on to the replacement fund. Again, the purpose of this is to take care of the predictable cost of maintaining or replacing the major assets of the community. So for example, if we have boulevard fences and we have them painted and we want them always to look good, then you can do a real easy calculation to determine that, well, if we want to paint them every 5 years and it's going to cost us about $20,000, then we need to put aside $4,000 every year, and that will mean we'll have $20,000 when it's time to paint. Now, there are lots of assets in a community, and we don't put money aside for everything. So we don't put aside money for low dollar items. And a good example of that is a pool motor. A pool motor itself for a wading pool or a baby pool will typically cost about $250, $350 may be installed. You don't need to put money aside for things like that, and especially if it's got an unpredictable life. The life of a motor, depending on the conditions in your pump room and a variety of other things, can last anywhere from 366 days, because there's a 365-day warranty and it never goes bad within the warranty period. So 366 days to 8 or 9 years. And so if it's low cost and unpredictable life, there's no reason to put money aside typically. And we also don't put aside things for items with very short lives. For example, if one of our objectives is to power wash our entry monuments every year, you don't need to put money aside for that. That's an operating expense. You only put money aside for things that are greater than 1 year to start with. Otherwise, it's just an operating expense. And we also don't put monies aside for things with very long lives. An example being, if you have a clubhouse, we'll put money aside for the roof and the walls and the painting and everything, but generally not for the foundation. That foundation is going to last a very long time unless there's a failure. But if there isn't a failure, it's going to go a long time. One of my favorite examples of a long life thing that we don't always put money aside for are brick walls. And we're talking about the walls that are built from a foundation and really solid. The reason that's a favorite example is this really happened. I was vacationing up in Boston 1 year right around budget time, and I remember taking a phone call on my cell phone from one of the managers asking about specifically brick walls and how much they ought to put aside to reserve for that. And I was literally, was so ironic, I was literally sitting, if you've ever been to Boston, I was sitting across the street from Paul Revere's house. There's just a tiny little plaza right there across from Paul Revere's house. And in front of the Paul Revere's house is a brick wall. So I'm staring at this brick wall that had been there for, at that time, 200 and many years. And I'm trying to think, okay, so what sort of a lifetime should we put on this? And how many dollars per year should we be putting aside? And so my point of all that is, if it's a very long life, even if it's an expensive asset like building a brick wall, we typically would not put funds aside. Companies who specialize in reserve studies typically put that life at either 40 or 50 years as their cutoff for what they include in a study. We typically are using those same numbers. So, how do you calculate how much you ought to have in your replacement fund? That's done by a process called a reserve analysis. I'll be talking about a reserve analysis in a moment. Lots of examples. Deerfield just replastered their swimming pool. They replaced a chain link fence with ornamental iron. Those are replacement projects. Bridlewood Estates has a beautiful ranch-style fence around the majority of the community. It's a white ranch-style fence. Unfortunately, it's in the Houston area and it is a little humid, so it gets mildewed. So They both have to power wash and paint that fence to keep it looking wonderful. Colony Grant replaced an archaic pump and fountain for one of the lakes in the community with a floating fountain. Changed technology and improved energy efficiency by doing that. Dancing Bear Ranch had some gates that were a little bit problematic and you couldn't always depend on them opening. And they did a whole lot of work getting them in good shape. And then we have several others that are listed on that particular slide. Those are all examples of replacement projects. Let's move on to the next one. We've talked operating, replacement, now we're on to the capital fund. Again, this is for new community assets. So if we decide we want to build a playground, $40,000, we want to save up for it, and in 4 years we want to have it done, then we need to put aside $10,000 a year in order to reach our goal. That's pretty easy math. The math sounds very similar to what I just talked about on the replacement page regarding if we want to repaint a fence every 5 years and how much we'd put aside. So the calculations are very similar. Now, putting money aside is one way to do it, but for capital projects specifically, but even for replacement projects, there's the option of getting a loan. You know, normally we're getting our money from the homeowners. Maybe there's a bank who'll just give us free money. So a loan for a capital project is just a variation of saving up and then doing it, or getting a loan, doing it now, and then paying off the loan. So it's just a variation on timing. So how do you calculate the ideal balance for a capital fund? Well, that all comes from a capital project plan. What do you want to do? How much is it going to cost? And when do you want to have it complete? That's essentially what a capital project plan is. If you have no plans, or maybe no land, no ability to add something new, then you don't need a capital fund. So a capital fund is only necessary if you want to accomplish something new, create something new for the community, a new physical asset. And lots of examples here. One of the second one on here, Vicksburg, that's an example of a community that already had boulevard fences throughout the community that the developer put in. But the developer in the governing documents said all those fences belong to the homeowners. The problem was, as the community was aging and pickets got broken, sometimes the homeowners were fixing them, sometimes they weren't. It was a stained fence, and so sometimes they weren't painting it. And so the community as a whole amended their CC&Rs, their governing documents, to indicate that these fences are now the obligation of the association. And so that first replacement of those fences was actually a capital project, because those fences never belonged to the association until those CC&Rs were amended. So that would be a capital project. And that kind of brings up the point of anything that you create from a capital project all of a sudden becomes a replacement asset of the association. So in the case of Vicksburg, building the fence the first time was a capital project, and then money was set aside for future replacements in the replacement fund. Quail Run, that was an amazing project done many years ago. It's a large community, has about 1,400 homes, but they decided that they wanted a community center, and they went for it. Again, this was probably 20 years ago, and they built a $1.4 million community center. A full-size basketball court with a very expensive floor on it. It had kitchen areas, it had meeting rooms, it had party rooms, had a big room that would hold 200 people in it. And they accomplished that. As with a combination of assessment increases and a loan, they were able to do a gigantic project like that, way beyond what you would normally see an association doing. This year, Deer Hollow added an electronic access system to their clubhouse and swimming pool that wasn't there before. The capital fund did the project. We are now setting aside funds for when various components have to be replaced in the future. So we've talked about operating fund, replacement fund, capital fund. Let's talk about the fourth one now, which is special purpose fund. Now, a special purpose fund can be used for a whole lot of things. It could be like an operating fund. So we're setting something aside to create a new short-term activity. Maybe we want to start having security for a little while for some reason. And people are actually contributing to that, if you would, surge of security. It might be replacement-like. In other words, we have an existing asset, but we didn't put money aside for it, and it needs to be replaced now. So a special assessment, for example, to fix the roads. Or it might be a capital-like special purpose fund. We want to build that playground, and we haven't put any money aside for it. The key and what makes a special purpose fund important is that you are collecting money from somebody, and you're promising that if they give you that money, you will use it exactly as you said you would. It doesn't go into some general fund. It is money set aside for the purpose that you promised to use it for. So special assessments are always a special purpose fund. Whenever you have a vote for a special assessment, you say, please vote to pay $300 and we will use it to put in security cameras at the gates. Whatever it might be. But a special purpose fund is collected for a particular purpose. So let me give you some examples of this. One that's a interesting one is a special assessment in Valley Lodge. Valley Lodge is a community in Simonton, Texas, in far west Fort Bend County. And Valley Lodge, the population of Valley Lodge, which is not a large community, but the population of Valley Lodge is about 70% of the population of the city of Simonton. It's the majority of Simonton. Simonton incorporated, a long time ago, simply to prevent Houston from annexing them. But Valley Lodge is out in far west Fort Bend County. Their roads are public roads. However, the city of Simonton doesn't have much revenues coming in. And so when the roads needed repair in Valley Lodge, the owners of Valley Lodge voted for a special assessment, and it passed. And so that special assessment was collected. The community then took all the funds that were collected, handed them over to the city, who was then able to work a deal with the county of Fort Bend, where the county would contribute all the manpower and equipment, and the money that was turned over to them was used to buy the asphalt and the materials that were needed. And so that was a great example of a special assessment for a particular purpose in combination with a municipal entity to get a project done. It worked very, very well. But what was actually interesting is we built out the special assessment. When essentially all of it had come in, we wrote a check to the county, to the city, so they could start the project. Well, as always, not everyone pays on time, and there were a few people who didn't pay by the time we wrote the check, but we got a payment later. And I remember the difference that came in afterwards was, and the special assessment was only like $30 or maybe a little more. But I remember It was $60, that's it. Afterwards, a few more payments came in that totaled $182 and some change. And you say, that's minor. Let's, have a party with it, whatever it was. Unfortunately, or this was a special assessment, those funds were collected for the purpose of road work. And so the association couldn't say, let's just put it into the general fund. It was collected for that purpose. So we had it on the balance sheet for probably 2 years. And then finally, when some signage work needed to be done, we donated that extra $182 to the city of Simonton to put some signage on the roads that was needed. Otherwise, we would have just had it there, sitting there forever. So that's a special purpose fund. There's a couple others that are listed here. The second one had to do with a lawsuit, where this was a construction defect lawsuit. The developer ended up paying a large sum of money to the Treehouse condominiums for damages that had not occurred yet. These were structural defects. Some had showed themselves, and so those are taken care of. But there was additional funds that was set aside in the special purpose fund to be used each time those defects showed up on other units. And then the last two that are on here, before we go to a question, is related to donations. There's sources of money, as we talked about in Treehouse, that don't come from assessments. In these particular cases, both in Crestwater and South Glen Village, owners took up donations to be used for a particular purpose. In Crestwater, they wanted to get some trees planted around the lake. And the association said, sure, you raise the money, we'll plant the trees. In the case of South Glen Village, owners in a particular section of the community wanted a playground on their side of the community. The board was going to do it many years from now, but they said, look, if you raise enough money, we'll add our money to the pot and we'll get it done faster. So those are all good examples of special purpose funds. And I think we've got a question here. So what is it?
We have a question coming from Sugar Land, Texas. The question is, who is capable of conducting a special assessment if the request is approved by the voters? Is it the board or the management?
That's a good question, an interesting question. First of all, a special assessment is something that would need to be brought up generally by the board of directors, although it could be an initiative that comes from homeowners. And the board of directors would determine that a special assessment is needed for whatever purpose the board or the homeowners have suggested. The board of directors would then come to us as the management company to go through our super budget model and see how many dollars we need to accomplish it. If it's a $100,000 project, that doesn't necessarily mean we need $100,000. There may be funds that are already set aside or funds that will be taken from other areas. So through our super budget model, we would be able to determine the total amount of cash that needs to be raised, divide it by the number of homes, multiply it by the collection rate, and that would be the proposed special assessment. At that point, the board of directors would approve the ballot initiative. In other words, what do the words say? We want to you to vote on a special assessment of X number of dollars to be used for this purpose. And typically when you're doing a special assessment, you then have a bunch of detail that sits behind the ballot. It may be renderings, it may be detailed descriptions of what will be done and timing and plans and all those good things. Once that decision is made that we want to now issue it for vote, then the members get to vote. And there's a variety of methods for them to vote. but they vote. When you reach whatever the threshold is, it's normally a pretty high threshold. When you reach that threshold, it passes. And at that point, the ballot initiative is done. The board of directors can then levy that assessment. In other words, bill all the homeowners, start collecting it, and start proceeding with the particular project that it was collected for. And if it's coming from the community I'm thinking of, maybe at another time I'll have to tell the story about that project. That was one of the, it's just a wonderful, wonderful project that was done in that particular community. And it's the only community, part of the project, it's the only community we've ever managed that has a zip line. Part of the project, the improvements in the community, a small part of the improvements was a new park area that has a zip line. It's probably about I'd say about a 90-foot long, maybe 100-foot long zip line that's very low to the ground, but it's super cool. Somewhere there's a video of me on it, but I won't tell where it is. Okay, good question. Thank you very much. All right, let's move on to, we've talked about the 4 funds where we're accumulating money. Again, the operating fund, replacement fund, capital fund, and maybe special purpose funds. But where does the money come from that goes into these funds? It comes from the homeowners. Doesn't matter where else, it's coming from the homeowners. Maybe there's a little investment interest. Maybe there's some newsletter advertising. Maybe you can get some outside donations, but the vast majority is coming from the owners themselves. And it's all going into some big cloud, some big pot or bag of money that is a combination of all of those funds. And then you're constantly taking money out for operating purposes. Every year or every couple years, you may be taking money out for major asset maintenance, in other words, from your replacement fund. And if you have capital projects, you typically won't have many of them. Maybe you have one, or over several years, maybe you'll do 2. That money all comes out in one big chunk. And so that bag of money, if you will, it's illustrated as a big cloud here, is constantly getting bigger and smaller as you're putting money in and as you're taking money out for the various objectives. But the key is, it's coming from the homeowners. No matter what it is, that's where it's coming from. So now we're going to do a few super budget calculations. And we're going to start with the operating fund. And on the operating fund, I said earlier that the ideal balance, or the target level, the ideal balance of the operating fund is going to be some percentage of your normal operating expenses. And so in this particular example, very, very summarized, we're saying that the total revenues of this particular association are $220,000. And that the amount that they spend every year on those operating items, the electricity, the water, the grounds maintenance contract, the management contract, postage, copies, legal expenses, all of that stuff, normally adds up to $180,000. So I've said the ideal balance is proportional to those normal operating expenses. In this particular example, I'm saying we're using 30% is what the target is for the character of this particular community. So 30% times $180,000 is $54,000. Boom, that's it. You're done with the calculation. That's what it is. I'm going to show you a little bit more on this particular slide. We'll get more to it later, so don't get too concerned about what you're going to see here. But if we had $220 of revenues and $180 of expenses, that left $40,000 left over. What in the world do we do with that? What do we do with that net revenue or that net income after we've done all of our normal operations? Well, under the super budget model, whatever is left over and we intentionally know what is going to be left over, it's an important part of the calculation, is allocated among whatever funds we have, our replacement fund, capital fund, operating fund, and maybe some special purpose funds. How it's allocated, again, I'm just briefly going to describe it. The model says each one of these funds has an ideal value. Each one of these funds has an actual value. It says how far is each one from where we want it to be, and that's how it does the allocations. It's trying to get all of them up to their ideal value. So anything left over is going to be spread between those three funds to get them closer to their ideal values. So that's how we calculate the operating fund. It's pretty easy calculation. Now let's move on to how we calculate the ideal value for the replacement fund. I already indicated earlier that this is done by something called a reserve analysis. I'm showing you a very simple reserve analysis here. Later on, when I show you some actual super budget, you'll see the same format, but you'll see many, many, many more assets that are on it. So in this particular community, we're only going to talk about 4 assets. It only has 4 things that are out there that we're reserving for. So on the left-hand side, we have the asset itself. For example, the pool plaster. We have an asset of the clubhouse roof that needs to be replaced at some point. We have an asset of a boulevard fence. And this particular boulevard fence is painted. And so we need to repaint it every once in a while. So those are the 4 assets of this community. As we move across to the right, we'll see a number of columns. Last repair year. In other words, when was this installed, or when was it last fixed or repaired? So we can see, for example, on the pool plaster, it was last replastered in 2013. The next column says, what's the useful life? What is the life of this thing? How long will pool plaster last? How long will a clubhouse roof last? And all of those things. And this says that for pool plaster, if you've already replastered it in the past, you're going to get probably 8 years of life out of a pool plaster. So if you last resurfaced it in 2013, if it's going to last 8 years, that means in 2021, we should expect it's going to be time to do it again. The next column says, how much is it going to cost? This says it costs $24,000 to replaster. I'm going to come back to this column in just a minute, but $24,000. And so it's saying, well, if it's 2013, this is the 2018 budget, so I've had 4 years from 13 to 17 to accumulate funds. That's half of the life. So if I'm halfway through the life, I ought to have half of $24,000 sitting in the bank today. And for the next several years, specifically the next 4 years, I need to put aside $3,000 per year. So by 2021, I will have all $24,000 sitting in the bank. So that's how this works. And you do that for each one of the assets. They all have different lives, different times will they be repaired, different values. Their accumulation is going to go from nothing when it's brand new to full value when it's time to replace it. And then the accumulation will all be spent and go back to 0 again and start accumulating again. So that's how this works. There are 2 extremely important numbers here. So let me show those to you. They're right there at the bottom. And these tell us very important things. So the column on the left-hand side that's circled says, this is the accumulated balance as of December 31st, 2017. In other words, how much money should we have in the bank in our replacement fund as of the end of 17? It's saying $30,000. Everything is worth $147,000, but some of it's new. Some of it's only slightly old, some's very old. So all we need to have in the bank today for full coverage of those assets is $30,640. The other circle at the bottom right says that, and in order to make sure that every asset is covered and we have the money in the bank when it's time for every asset to be replaced, this year in 2018, or next year in 2018, we need to specifically set aside $11,320. So those are two very important pieces of information. How much should we have today? How much do we need to set aside next year? Great information. Before I get off the slide, I mentioned that I did want to go back here and talk about the column which is current replacement cost. Notice it says current replacement cost. It's not saying what is the cost in 2021. It's saying what does it cost today? And that's important because we know what it's going to cost today. We resurface dozens of swimming pools every single year. We replace roofs every year. We paint fences. We replace fences every year. We have a really good feel for what the cost is in either the Houston market or the San Antonio market to accomplish these things. We know what it costs today based on the size, dimensions of that particular asset. And so we can put that number down with confidence. What we can't do in the case of the roof is say, so in 2025, 8 years from now, what's it going to cost us to do that roof? I don't know. That's a harder thing for us to do in our heads. That's where the model comes in. All of these projects, and you'll see it when we look at the actual spreadsheet, the model is using inflation to take today's cost and apply them to what we expect the cost to be 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. So that's one of the powers of the reserve analysis is we let the calculations project off into the future and we use what we know today to be the real cost to put into the reserve analysis. So that's how this works. So we've now found that on the operating fund, the ideal value is a percentage of operating expenses. We found that on the replacement fund, you use the reserve analysis to calculate those two key numbers. Let's get into the capital project plan, which is how we come up with the ideal value for the capital fund. Remember, we only need a capital fund if we want to do things that are new. So in this particular example, what we're seeing is that this particular community has decided that they would like to install a second monument at the back entry. They also want to put in a really short jogging trail, quarter-mile jogging trail at the park that they already have. When they get a little more money, they would also like to put some exercise stations around the jogging trail. And then finally, they want to put a shade cover, a little pavilion with places where people can sit down and rest, have lunch, and things of that sort. So they started thinking about these projects in 2014. They added the monument thing there. A few years later, they decided, well, let's make improvements to our park. They decided when they want to try to get these done. They estimated the current cost. And through the same sort of calculations we just saw on the reserve study, the reserve analysis, we can do the same here. We end up with the numbers at the bottom that says to accomplish these goals on the time frame that we have specified, we need to today, at the end of 2017, need $42,000 sitting in the bank accounts. And if we want to get them all done, then in 2018 we need to contribute $17,000 more to our capital fund. And if we do that, we're going to accomplish everything we need. Now, those of you who like to do math, I don't hear anyone saying I like to do math, but I'm sure several out there are saying that. Here's a little thought experiment for you. So we're sitting right now approaching 2018, and our first project, that monument, is going to be done in 2019. So in 2018, we need to put $17,000 aside. How much do we need to put aside, let's say in 2020, to continue to accomplish all of our goals? Well, the answers are showing on this slide. As soon as we accomplish that particular project and complete the monument, we don't need to put $4,000 aside each year for that particular project. It's done. And so when we get to 2020, the amount we put aside is not $17,000, but it drops down to $13,000. And to go a little further, how much do we need to put aside in the year 2025? Well, according to the chart, everything's done. And so if there's nothing left to do, the contributions into the capital fund in 2025 would be zero. What would our balance in the capital fund be in 2025? Zero. We would have accumulated everything we needed, and we would have spent everything we needed. We're done. We can now rest and enjoy the park pavilion and the exercise stations. So that's the capital project plan. That's how you calculate what the ideal values are. I'd like to now talk about alternative financing. As I indicated earlier, all the funds for whatever we want to do pretty much are coming from homeowners. But there are different ways that we can affect the timing of projects. So let's talk about those three. One is that we can, other than just collecting from contributions as I've been talking about, in other words, normal financing would be we just accumulate the funds, put it aside. When we're ready to do it, we write a check, we're all done. But alternative financing is how we could alter that timing, how we can do things in a different sequence. And there are three ways to do it. One is we can have a special assessment. A special assessment generally has a pretty high hurdle of approval of the membership. It would be very unusual that a board of directors on their own could approve a special assessment. Typically, it is a high vote of the membership. 2/3 is a number that you'll see very often. And unless it is an issue that is going to be well supported by the membership, it's hard to get that amount. And so special assessments are a way to go, but many times it's difficult to reach that hurdle. A second way is to get a bank loan. We'll talk about a bank loan in just a moment, but a bank loan, you go to a bank, you get a loan, and then you pay it back. Another alternative is, let's say we do have these three funds. We have our operating fund, we have our replacement fund, we have our capital fund. And our operating fund is right at target level, our replacement fund is at target level. Our capital fund is a little low, but we really want to do this project now. Well, how about if we loan the money to ourselves? In other words, we, with proper foresight and projections and all, we take some of the money we have in the operating fund or the replacement fund and use it for that capital project, and then just rebuild the others as we want to. So we can do some internal borrowing. As I mentioned, ultimately it's the owners, however, who are financing whatever we choose to do. So there's one theoretical question I always like to ask, and it's surprising how many times that people have come up with this answer, because I think it's really it can be twisted logic unless you're thinking about it in the way I'm about to describe. Now, this alternative financing, keep in mind what it does is it changes the timing of cash flows. It changes the timing of when owners are paying for whatever's being done. And so you could make a theoretical argument, and it's truly theoretical. This is not generally a consideration in making these financing decisions. But you could make a theoretical argument that replacement expenditures should always come from accumulated funds. And capital projects should always come from bank loans. Now I'm saying it strongly because in theory that is totally correct. I'll give you just 1 second to think about it. Okay, you've thought about it. Here's the reason why. And think about that individual homeowner who is paying their assessment. If I have a swimming pool that I need to resurface the plaster, and I am a homeowner who leaves the community on the day the project is done, I move out. I am the one who wore down that plaster. I am the one who utilized that pool and got it to the condition that required the replastering. So my funds that I have paid over the years are what should have been used to take care of that replastering. In other words, accumulated funds should take care of existing assets that I wore out. Let's move to the other case. I am a homeowner who moves out of a community on the day the playground is completed. Now, if we used accumulated funds, then all my money I paid to build that playground, I'm gone. I didn't get to utilize a bit of the enjoyment of that playground for the money I paid into it. Whereas, if instead the association paid for that playground with a bank loan, I'm gone. I'm not paying that bank loan back. I'm out of there. Only the people who are there when the playground is built are the ones whose assessments are being used to pay back that bank loan. So that's the theory. It has to do with what money and who it's coming from is used for that project. So again, that's theoretical. It's almost never used in actual considering which way to go. Let's go a little bit further. I talked about bank loans. I said special assessments are hard to go with. Bank loans are a possibility. What are the limitations on bank loans? Let's look at this one. Are they actually an option for associations? Well, the answer is absolutely they're an option. Are they an easy option? Sometimes. So bank loans can be necessary because you didn't plan well and you didn't accumulate the funds as needed, or maybe you have unanticipated projects, or maybe you just want to do things sooner than you would be able to do otherwise. The governing documents of your association will indicate what constraints your association may have on getting bank loans. In some cases, getting a loan requires a large vote of the membership, depending on some subtle wording in your documents. Many times it's in your Articles of Incorporation or Certificate of Formation. Sometimes it's in the CC&Rs. But depending on some very specific wording, either the board of directors has the authority to go out and get a loan, or the members need to authorize going out to get a loan. And that's something that your community manager or your attorney can look at and give you an indication of whether or not it would be easy or difficult to be able to get a loan. But if you can get a loan, you then run into the problem of who do you get a loan from. Many commercial banks just don't understand the animal called homeowners association. We don't make widgets, we don't have inventory, we don't have collateral. And so if you try to go to a regular bank, there may be difficulty in actually getting a loan from them because they want collateral. They want you to sign over your clubhouse or something as collateral, as you would if you got a loan for your home is a collateral. The problem is that If they foreclose on your home, they can sell it. If they foreclose on a clubhouse, it's a restricted reserve. They really can't do anything with it. And so there are specialty banks who know the industry, who know how it works. And the collateral that they understand and use is future assessments. Said in a stark way, is you don't pay the loan, we get to bill your owners for the assessments and keep the money. Now that's a very stark way of putting it, but it simply indicates that they can grab a portion of your assessment revenue if necessary if you're not making the loan payments. Loans for associations are very, very, very stable. The bank that we work with most, Mutual of Omaha Bank, I've talked to them on a number of occasions about loans and their success with loans, and they almost never have a default on a community association loan for many, many reasons. So it's a good loan for a bank to make if they understand the business. Today, loan rates continue to be very low. We can get a loan for under 5%. Compare that to other commercial loans, and you'll see that it continues to be a good rate. And unlike a home loan where you can get a fixed rate for 30 years, we don't have that hard physical collateral that they could foreclose on. And so in association loans, banks are not willing to give 30-year fixed rates. We can typically get up to about a 7-year fixed rate loan. If you need a loan that's longer than that, it's typically fixed for 7 years, and then it recalculates to whatever the new interest rates are for the remaining years of the term. But loans are a good option. If an association is interested in using a loan to accomplish its financial objectives, we run that loan through our super budget model, and it will indicate, okay, how much do we need to accumulate to put down a down payment? You don't get 100% loans. It's reasonable to get a 80% loan, in other words, 80% of your project, and maybe a 90% loan, 90% of your project. So you have to have some cash to be able to start the loan process. And then, most importantly, you need to be able to pay back your loan. And so the super budget model can look at, do we have enough money? And with our assessments or projected increases in assessments, are we able to pay back a loan over a 7-year period or a 5 or a 4-year period? So the super budget is very helpful in that sort of modeling. Let's take a look at now from a financial standpoint, do we want a loan or do we want to accumulate money into a capital fund? And in this particular example, I'm going to use some very round numbers. We're going to pick a playground project. It's going to cost $100,000, so we have a nice round number. And the question is, can we build it now with a bank loan or build it in 5 years after we've accumulated the money in order to do the project? So let's look at both sides of this. Let's start with a bank loan. So if we get a bank loan today, we can do the project today in 2017. The construction cost is $100,000. That's what the project is. And even though I said we can't get a 100% loan, we need to put down some money. In this example, I'm going to assume the bank is going to give us the full $100,000 just to simplify the calculations a little bit. So the construction cost is $100,000. The bank gives us $100,000 to build, and we need to pay back at some point $100,000 to the bank. Now the bank is also going to want to earn some money. They're going to want to earn some interest on the loan. For this example, I've assumed a 6% interest rate. 6% over a 5-year period, so this is a 6% fixed loan for 5 years. So over that 5-year period, we would have paid $15,997 in interest. So the total amount we paid was $115,997 over this 5-year period. 60 payments that total up to that. So, in order to be able to pay that back, we need to get from our homeowners, our only source, $23,199 per year. If you multiply $23,199 times 5, that's where you get the $115,000. Okay, good. So that's how much we need to get from homeowners. Let's look at the accumulation scenario. So in the accumulation scenario, we can't build now. We'll build 5 years from now in 2023. Now, costs are going to go up. That $100,000 project is going to cost more in 5 years. If we assume inflation is going up by 2.5% in 5 years, that $100,000 project will cost $113,000. Stick with me for a moment. Now, when we're putting aside money that people give us through their assessments, we're going to have it in a bank account, and we're going to earn a little bit of interest on that bank account. So if you skip down 2 lines, over 5 years, as we're accumulating all this money, we will have earned $1,670 worth of interest that the bank gave us for keeping the money in their bank. So if we're earning $1,600 in interest, then the amount we need to contribute to the fund is a line above that, $111,000. The $1,600 plus $111 gives us $113 we need to pay for the project 5 years from now. So how much do we need to get from assessments? We only need to get $111,000 divided by 5 years, or $22,000 per year that will come from the homeowners. So to compare the two, here's both scenarios, and what we see is that if we want to do it now, it's going to cost us 4% more. And I think all of you would have said ahead of time that a bank loan is going to cost us more than just saving for it and doing it. You're absolutely right. What I want to point out here is it's only about 4%. Now, we're at very, very low bank loan interest rates. If it were more typical times, the cost of getting a bank loan could be up to 20% higher than accumulating the funds. So we're really in a unique time now with interest rates so low. The positive side of that is, if you want to do a project, now's the time to do it sooner using a bank loan before, if we're lucky, interest rates go up. Well, it depends on which side of that you're on. From a earnings standpoint, money in the bank standpoint, interest rates go up. From a loan standpoint, we want, of course, the rates to stay down. So, if this is the conclusion that it's going to cost you more to get a bank loan, why would you ever want a bank loan? Well, there are a couple reasons. If we have something like we don't have the money to replace the roofs on the townhomes or the condominiums, and they're all leaking, well, we don't really have the flexibility of accumulating the funds, if we don't already have them, before we need to fix the roof. So there may be a real physical need to get this project done now. But if we look at the example of the playground, why would we want to pay more? Well, there's a good reason. If we do it now, we've got this beautiful new playground, and everyone in the community can enjoy it for 5 additional years. They don't have to wait for 5 years. If that is an important asset that people moving into the community or looking to buy in the community, if this is a community where there's a lot of families with young children and we're missing this asset and we put it in, that could have an effect on home values. That there'll be more people who are willing to move into the community because we have this beautiful playground. And so even though it may cost the association, in this case 4% more, it may help on something like home values. It may help people to sell their homes. And everyone who lives in the community will have 5 years more enjoyment of the facility. So there really are good reasons why you might want to pay a little more to get something sooner. Okay, what I'd like to move on to now is go on to a couple really important graphs. And on these two graphs that you'll be seeing, this one and the next one, we're going to be, hopefully you will burn these graphs into your head when you're trying to think of how funds can go up and down, what the trends are, and how much money we should have in the bank, and how it does vary over time. So this first example here, just so I can illustrate it in a simple way, is for an association who happens to be right where they need to be with their fund balances. Everything is exactly where they ought to be. They've been doing super budgeting for years and they're where they need to be. And so what happens to our funds over time? Well, let's look at this particular graph. This is showing a 10-year period, and it is showing in orange, the bottom line, the bottom section of the graph, it is showing you the operating fund. And you can see over time, the amount of the operating fund is going from about $50,000 on the left-hand side up to about $62,000, $64,000 on the right-hand side. And they're right at where they ought to be. So why is that increasing? Why would you expect the operating fund over time to increase? Well, that's pretty simple. The operating fund is proportional to your operating expenses, and over time, inflation will increase your costs, so you would expect a slow rise in the ideal value of your operating fund. And that's what you're seeing right here. Now let's go to the center section, the reddish section of the graph, and that's the replacement fund. Okay, in this particular one you can see, and this is a stacked graph, so you can see there is a significant amount in the replacement fund back in 2012. And then that section starts getting narrower and narrower as we get to 2015. It gets a little bigger as we get into 2017. It drops again in 18. It starts rising again through 2021. How do you explain that shape? That the ideal value gets bigger and smaller and everything else? Well, that all has to do with why we have a replacement fund. When things are old, we need a lot of money. When everything's new, we need less money. So each time we spend money, the ideal value drops because we got something that was old and we changed it into something that was new. And so if you were trying to put a narrative on this red section in the center, you would say from 2012 to 2013, we were just accumulating money. In 2013 to 2014 to 2015, it looks like we did several projects. We spent money and improved things. From 15 through 17, we were accumulating funds again. In 18, we did another project. In 19, 20, and 21, maybe we were doing some small projects because it wasn't going up too much, but in general, we were accumulating during those years. And so there's a story that goes with these pictures. But the important point is you can look at this picture and you can determine that where we are in the life cycle of our assets. Finally, we look at the top section of the graph, and that's capital fund. And if you kind of look at that, you'll see that that is getting a little thicker and thicker and thicker and thicker all the way from 2012 all the way through 2019. And then in 2020, it goes to zero. There's no more capital fund. And that's exactly the shape you would expect, the amount that you would need at any point in time for a community with one project in mind. They wanted to do one thing, and if you kind of look at what those numbers are, it was about a $40,000 project that they did in 2020. That's all there is, don't need anything else. So that's the shape of the various funds and the trends over time. If you look at the very top, that's the total amount that the association had in all these funds over time. So they kind of peaked in 2019 at about $138,000, and they hit a minimum in 2020 somewhere just around a little over 100,000. So things don't always go up. They go up and down depending on your plans, depending on the character of the association. So that's a good graph to think about fund trends. Now let's move from all this theory about funds and how much we ought to have to reality. And I really like this example because this graph right here is something that will be confusing if someone in the audience at that annual meeting asks a question and wants to be devious. So if I go to my annual meeting for my community, the community manager could expect a question like this. So let's start with this graph right here. Brandy is smiling at me because she has seen this. So this graph right here, on the last one we were talking about the ideal values of our funds. This graph is showing us how much actual cash we have in the bank at any time. This one is only a 1-year period. It's actually about a 15-month period, but it's 1 year versus the other one was long-term. It was over a 10-year period. So in this particular example, we've added a fourth section. At the bottom we have our operating fund, we have the yellow replacement fund, we have the light blue capital fund, and then we have something I'll just refer to as net income. So let's quickly do the bottom three. Over a 1-year period, the amount in your operating fund is about the same as it was at the end of the year as it was at the start of the year. Maybe it's 3% higher. If we didn't do any projects, your replacement fund is whatever it was at the start of the year plus this year's contributions. Same thing with the capital fund, wherever we started the year plus this year's. So those three go up slightly. Whatever basically the net income, net revenue after operations was, that's the only increase there. Then you've got this big whale that's sitting up on top. This particular example is from an association with an annual assessment. This shape would be slightly different if you had semi-annual, quarterly, or monthly assessments, but it makes it easier to explain for just one assessment per year that's due on January 1st. So this is illustrating the total cash in the bank. And I want to start all the way over to the left. So way over in the left, we have about $210,000 sitting all in the bank. That's part reserve funds, part just cash that we're using to pay our current bills. And by September of each year, all the revenues that are going to come in have pretty much come in. And we're just spending money. And so our total cash in the bank keeps dropping and dropping. And then what do? C.I.A. Services presents you with a super budget. You say, oh, this is cool, approved. We send out assessments, and what do homeowners start doing? We send out the assessments maybe in October. They start paying. So all of a sudden, our revenues start coming in. We get a little bit in October, a little bit in November, a bunch in December, a bunch more in January. Due January 1st, overdue January 31st, but still we have some people who don't pay on time. So we continue to have revenues coming in before the summertime, before we're doing weekly mowing, before the pool opens, before we have all these water expenses for irrigation. So in the winter months, we're not paying a whole lot, but starting in December and January, our revenues are really coming in. So for associations with an annual assessment due in January, the total cash in the bank typically is peaking in March or April. If you have high collection rates, it may be March. Slightly lower collection rates, it would be typically in April is when they peak. And that's what you're seeing on this particular graph. Once we get in the majority of the revenues, we start getting into the summer season with all of our extra expenses. And that's where the total cash in the bank starts dropping and dropping and dropping, and typically hits a minimum in around October. Then what do? Approve a budget, send out assessments, people start paying. So that explains the shape of the graph, but I want to point out some really important things about the shape of this graph. That net income, that big blue part up there, this is actually very typical of an association in terms of the magnitude of the three funds at the bottom, the reserve funds, and the what we'll call the net income, the today's money that we're going to spend by the end of the year. And so you can see that that light or the darker blue is a very big chunk that can dominate what the fund balances are, what the reserve fund balances are. And you'll see that if you just kind of take that line as we get out into October, the top line, and see that it's trending downward, if we did not send out next year's assessments, that line would go all the way down to just the light blue line. In other words, even when we're at our minimum, the amount sitting in the bank is significantly more than what we have reserved for those particular funds. In this particular example, it's showing that in October we have about $150,000 in all of our reserve funds, but in addition we have about $60,000 or $70,000 that we would use by the end of the year if we didn't start sending out next year's assessments and collecting it. So the point of all this is we can't confuse the cash in the bank with what we have set aside in our various reserve funds. I'll show you that in the next slide and a little bit closer. The other part of this is that when you are being presented with the super budget this time of year, August, September, October timeframe, look at this particular graph. And what do you see? You see that we, the community manager, we're going to tell you our reserve fund levels are $150,000. And if we happen to be under where we need to be, we'll say, and you need to increase your assessments. But you are a sharp board member, and so you come over here and you pull out the balance sheet that happens to be in your board package, and you say, Ralph, you're saying we ought to have $150,000 in our reserve funds. And you're saying we need to raise our assessments. But I'm looking at the balance sheet and I'm seeing that we have $200,000 there. That doesn't make any sense, Ralph. And that's a logical conclusion, unless you have this graph burned in your brain and you realize that in addition to our fund balances, we have the money that we're using today within this current year. That's that dark blue part. So keep that in mind whenever you're looking at fund balances versus actual cash in the bank. And we show that on the next slide. The balance sheet is where you're going to see all these numbers. And the balance sheet has two parts. The top part is called assets, the bottom is called liabilities and equity. Your fund balance is shown at the bottom, the very bottom of the bottom section of the balance sheet. And you can see in this particular example that The association has an operating fund, a replacement fund, and a capital fund. We also show current year expenses or expenditures. So in this particular example, we have a capital fund balance of about $20,000 in May of 2004. And year to date, we've spent $1,000 out of the capital fund. And that the total of all of our funds is $101,000. And here you can see it's not the same graph as was on the prior page, but you can see the operating fund, the replacement fund, you can see the capital fund, and then that bottom line is current year net income. That's that darker blue portion on the other graph. And in this particular example, you see that we have, again in the first column there, you can see we have $60,000 of that net income, which means only $40,000 is the reserved portion. So the graph we just saw shows a very good relative proportion for a typical community. So right here, again, we're at the bottom of the balance sheet. We're seeing where our funds currently sit. That's an important part because these numbers are what's going to tie into the super budget and our projections and all of those good things. So just keep in mind that in May of this particular year, the total fund balance was about $40,000 plus $60,000 of current year net income. Let's now look at the top of the balance sheet. The top of the balance sheet has all of our cash. This section you're looking at right now, this is the cash. And you can see that there's $102,000. The total cash is going to be similar to your net income plus all of your fund balances. It's never going to be equal for a variety of reasons, but they're going to be close. So we don't want to confuse cash with fund balances. Fund balances are always at the bottom of a balance sheet. Well, at this point, I'd like to cover one more topic before I show you a real super budget and what it looks like. Those of you who've seen one before already know what it's all about, but I want to point out a couple really cool things about it. Right now I want to talk about, since we've all been impacted either personally with friends or just with our own emotions, we've been impacted by the natural disasters that came in at, in the Rockport area, came up to Houston and Beaumont and over into Louisiana, and then what went through Florida and went through all the islands and is now created such difficulties in Puerto Rico. But let's talk about how natural disasters impact a particular association. The things we always need to consider as part of the super budgeting process and business planning process is our operating fund at adequate levels? We had talked about how we calculate the things we can control and things of that sort. If we have a natural disaster, that is a situation where our revenues may drop. We may have people who are displaced. We may have people who are trying to deal with insurance and they can't pay their assessments. They can't do the things they normally would be. So our revenues may drop. Same thing on the expense side. We may have situations where we're doing cleanup in the community that wasn't expected, that we're having general repairs that we're doing that we never reserved for. We didn't expect for our irrigation system to get destroyed by logs floating down the street or something of that sort. We may have instituted some special security in the community. So if we have our operating fund at the suggested levels, then we're going to be able to weather those things from an association standpoint. Well, let's talk about the physical assets. Our physical assets You say, well, if our clubhouse roof gets blown off, we're going to have to replace it years before we normally would. Well, physical assets are a little bit different because we buy insurance to deal with the physical assets. So we don't really need to look at our reserve fund, we need to look at our insurance coverage for those physical assets. What are the important considerations there? Do we have everything listed on our asset schedule? The asset schedule, I'm not talking about the one in the super budget, I'm talking about the one that's attached to your insurance policy that indicates what you're insuring. We need to make sure they're on there. You always want to get a policy that is based on replacement cost, undepreciated replacement cost. What you don't want is a policy that says if the roof on your clubhouse was 12 years old, that they're going to depreciate it to 25% of its value, and that's all they're going to give you to put a new roof on. So you want to make sure it has full undepreciated replacement cost coverage. You also need to be aware of exclusions in certain property coverage. For example, and we're all very familiar with this right now, rising water, floodwater, is always an exclusion of a property insurance policy. If you want to cover rising water, you need to have a flood policy, period. And it's not necessarily, if you're in a flood zone, you'll be required to have a flood policy. But even if you're not in a flood zone, believe me, the vast majority of the homes that were overcome in the Houston area were not in flood zones. And the vast majority did not have rising water or flood coverage, and therefore they're on their own. Same thing with associations. We had a couple of our Houston associations who had water at their swimming pools that was up 5 or 6 feet in the clubhouse or in the pool cabana. That's certainly going to hit all your wiring. It's going to short out every piece of pumping equipment that's in there and all of those things. And then finally, if you're in a coastal region, such as Galveston, Clear Lake area, wind is an exclusion, and you need to specifically get a wind endorsement for the policies. So those are things to consider. If you have those special perils, you may want to get those sort of policies in place, additional policies. And then there's even a policy that is offered through the C.I.A. Services Master Insurance Program that deals with mechanical breakdown. Mechanical breakdown is, in this particular case, would be a wonderful policy to have had if some of your pool equipment, pumping equipment, and other things like that were destroyed because they would not be excluded relative to a rising water event as we had right here. So those are the things to think about. Before we look at a super budget, I do want to answer a question here. Brandy, do we have one?
We have a question. We are seeing an increase in material costs for different replacements. Should associations be accounting for the increase in materials costs?
Well, that's another great question. Specifically during, since we're talking about natural disasters, specifically during situations like this, there are problems with prices going up due to shortages and things like that. That's not something you can particularly anticipate, and you wouldn't be putting funds aside in a reserve for that. What you would be doing is ensuring that you have adequate reserves so that you can deal with those unexpected things. That may be an operating fluctuation, as we talked about earlier. In terms of an overall trend in increase in materials costs, you're always going to want to be taking that into account. Every year when we redo the super budget, we're re-looking at the asset schedule. We're re-looking at the values. We're seeing that prices are going up. We want to reflect what it would cost today to replace that particular thing versus what we thought it would cost last year. So absolutely, and that's another one of those beauties of the super budget is, sure, we're looking at things that maybe 20 years from now we're going to be replacing them, but we have 20 opportunities between now and then to reevaluate the cost, to reevaluate the condition. Maybe it'll go 22 years. We don't know that now, but I guarantee you when we get to 19, we'll know if it's going to make 22. Likewise, it may only go 18, and I guarantee you by the time we get to 17, we will know it's not going to make 20. We need to replace it now. So that's one of the great things about the super budget. We're quite accurate short term, directionally accurate long term, and every year we're refining more and more years out ahead of us. Great, thank you for that question. Let's go ahead now. We're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about a super budget itself. And I want to show you a real super budget here, and I'm going to be going through this. This one is a real super budget, just got approved a couple weeks ago at a September meeting. This one happens to be for Deerfield. There's a lot of good things in here, but a great super budget always starts with a good memo. We'd like to present information in a variety of ways that will resonate with different people who process information differently. So if you want the big picture, it's all in this memo. If you want to get into the detailed numbers, boy, do we have a lot of numbers for you. If you're a visual person, we've got some great graphs. And all of that is in this super budget package. So it starts with this great memo that has information about what's included, what is a super budget. It talks about, in this particular case, this budget is based on a $726 assessment, same as last year. We talk about that there's nothing particularly unusual on the expenses. We did some things last year to adjust some costs. We got some new contracts in place. We then come down here and talk about replacements. And we said we had a lot of projects that we did. We're going to finish these last couple projects between now and the end of the year. And in 2018, these are the projects that we're projected to be doing. It goes through specifically, in this case, pool restroom remodeling for $12,000. We'll be doing some basketball court repairs for $800, etc. So it actually lists what these things are and gives you the big picture. This particular community, Deerfield, they have a fund that they refer to as their discretionary fund. It's essentially a capital fund. It's for doing new things. They call it a discretionary fund. And this talks a little bit about that fund, and then at the bottom it talks about their financial condition. That's all in the cover memo. And then we get into all these things, and these are going to be a little hard for you to see. I'll just pop it up just maybe a little bit larger here, or a little smaller, whatever I'm doing. Here's a plus sign. Okay. On all of these on the far right-hand side, you'll see note numbers. And later on at the very end, you'll see all the notes that describe what these things are about. But we start with Exhibit A, which is always assumptions. So it has basic information. What's the assessment? How much of an increase have we had over last year? How many lots? What's our collection rate and what's the inflation? The things that are gray over here are all actual information from prior years. We have our outlook for 2017, our budget for 18, and then we have several years worth of forecasts. So that's just the assumptions. Then we get into over here is the operating budget, Exhibit B. This looks very much like your monthly income statement. So we have, and all the same categories are going to be out here. On the left-hand side, we have our revenues, followed by all of our expenses. We have, in this case, 5 years worth of actual experience. And even if in our model we may have 10 or 15 years worth of actuals in there, but we'll only show you maybe the last 5. So we show you 4 or 5 prior years, where we're going to outlook this year, the budget, and then 4 or 5 years off into the future. Our super budget model typically goes out to about 2040, so we're actually about 25 years out into the future, but we'll only show you 4 or 5 years into the future. Our graphs will show you more. So here we have information on all of the particular revenues and expenses. Won't go through all of those, but it may be multiple pages. And then at the very bottom of Exhibit B, we have our net operating income that we've seen before, right over here. And if you remember way back to when we were calculating the ideal operating fund balance, we had a net income that we then allocated to replacement, capital, and operating. In this case, replacement, discretionary, and operating. So this is what the model does. It says to get things closer to where they need to be, that $60,000 or that $55,000 that we expect to have as a net income next year is going to be dropped into these 3 categories. That's Exhibit B. We then move on to Exhibit C. This is our replacements budget. It shows us what we've done in the past. Here we have all of our assets listed. We'll get to Exhibit F in a moment, which actually is our reserve analysis. But it has these listed, and it says that, for example, in 2016 we spent $5,000 on repainting the interior and exterior of the pool building. And we did these projects in 16, these in 13. Right here, if you recall, I said that we were going to be remodeling the restrooms. Well, there it is, 2018 budget, $12,000 for restroom remodeling at the swimming pool. We're going to be doing some expansion joints for $1,500, and you can go down further and further. If you go off into the future, you can see the projects that we'll be doing in those particular years. And so not only does this give you the financial impact, but it also gives you a project planning tool. So when do we plan to next resurface the tennis courts and things of that sort? You can see by looking at the super budget when we project those projects will be and what it will cost in those future years. Here's the bottom of it. So in 2018, we're planning on spending $17,000 in projects. In this year, we've had a big year, almost $80,000 in projects that we'll be completing by the end of 2017 for this particular community. We then go into the capital budget. Here it's called a discretionary fund. And you can see the various projects that have been done over time. In 2017, about $24,000 worth of projects that are all listed over here on the left-hand side. So for someone coming new onto the board, this historical look at what we have actually done, either on capital projects or replacement projects, is always interesting, and it tells us how much things cost. Finally, this schedule right here is the most important schedule of the whole super budget, because this is about money. How much money do we actually have? The top part is how much do we have in the operating fund at the beginning of the year, at the end of the year, replacement fund, discretionary or capital fund, and what are our total ending funds? So this said in 2012, this association had $149,000 in all its funds. In 2017, we'll end at $138,000. It's gone up, it's coming down, it'll keep going up. By 2019, we'll be over $200,000. So it floats up and down depending on what we're doing, what we're accumulating. So that's the actual dollars, but what's even more important is right at the bottom, our fund positions. We know what our target is. In this case, our target operating fund is 40% of operating expenses. Replacement fund from the reserve analysis, discretionary fund from the project plan. So we can look at each one. So let's look at the 2018 budget. Or 2017. We're going to end 2017 at this community at 92% of our target level in our operating fund, 40% of the target in our replacement fund, and 100% in our discretionary fund. Overall, we're at 57% of where we would like to be. All these numbers, all this detail boils down to one number. Where are we relative to where we ought to be? That's the beauty of this. It all comes down to one number. But what I personally find more beautiful, I'm going to skip past the asset schedule and all of those things, but you can see there's a lot of assets in a typical community. There we go, get past all this. The thing that is most beautiful about a super budget is right here. And so all of that detail, all of that information, all of those numbers comes down to a picture. Many times when our community managers are presenting a budget, we go over the memo a little bit, what's the big picture, and then we go directly to Exhibit G. This graph right here tells you the full picture of the association. It's saying this dotted line is our target. This is where we would have liked to have been in the past. This green vertical line is 2018, where we're going to be in 2018. And the dashed line off into the future is our future projections of where our targets are. The blue line in the past is where we actually were. This particular community saw its first super budget, full super budget in 2016. They happened to have been in reasonable shape, but they really didn't know. You never really know where you are unless you go in and do these calculations. You do this super budgeting modeling of all the detail. And so now they know where they're at. They've spent a bit of money in 16 and 17 to bring things back up to where they wanted them to be. And you'll see moving off into the future, in about 7 years, this association's going to be at its target levels. Could we get there sooner? Sure, we could raise assessments way up. But the nice thing is with the super budget model is you don't have to panic. You can see we're going in the right direction. You can see we are 60, 70, 80% of target. That's good. We want to be at 100, and we'll get there. And the next graph says how we get there. This shows us where we are, where we will be, but how do we get up to full funding? This one looks at assessments. And here we're going all the way back to 2001. So this is actually a 40-year graph. About half of it is in the past, where we've been. And over to the right of this green line is where we're moving off into the future. What you can see here, you can assume that prices are going to go up. And so if we just show the blue line of what our actual assessments are, it doesn't really tell you, are we going up more than we should? So we superimpose on this the red line, which is simply a 3% inflation line. So we say, starting in 2001, when the assessment was $440, inflation would have brought the assessment up at the red line level. In reality, they had increases about every 3 years, and without even knowing it, they were pretty much tracking what inflation would have been. They held off a little bit here, they maybe got a little behind, but with just inflationary increases in assessments, this community is going to be able to get up to 100% funding. And again, that's the beauty of the super budget is you can tell it with a picture. You can see the trends. You can look at this and feel comfortable that we're either going in the right direction or we need to make changes. So that's a super budget process. I've got one more question before we get to the last slide. And what is that, Brandy?
The question is that we noticed that you're using a 3% for inflation. We haven't been that high for at least a decade. Does that really mess up your future projections?
Good question. Someone is really getting into the details here. That's another nice thing about the super budget is we are using a 3% inflation factor. By changing one line in the assumptions area, we could change it to 2%, 1%. If we really think we know what we're doing. We could be 3% for a few years, 2%, 1%. We can do whatever we want on it. The reason we use 3 is it's conservative. We haven't been above 3 for, as the questioner just asked, for easily a decade. And long term, it's really been closer to 2.5%. That simply means that all of our projections are conservative. That if we're saying that our assessments will need to go up $10 3 years from now, maybe they'll only need to go up $8 3 years from now. But everything is based on that same inflation. So expenses are inflating at that rate. Our project costs are inflating at that rate. And our revenues needed to reach our goals are also being raised relative to that rate. So as long as we're using a higher inflation rate, it means we're conservative. So great question, but we're on the safe side. So let's go ahead and look at the very last slide here. And we're going to go back to the answers. At the very beginning, we asked some questions. And I want to zip through these real quick. Let me get over here. We asked some questions. How much we have in the bank and what should our assessment be? So now that you've gone through this, and you know that there is a science to this, there's a logic to how you come up with these, how much money should we have in the bank? When that question's asked at the annual meeting, the answer is, well, we need to have $30,000 in our replacement fund according to our reserve analysis. And we've got some great projects, those 4 projects that we showed to you earlier that we want to do. And in order to get those done on schedule, we need $42,000 in the bank for that right now. And in addition, to protect against all those things that happen that we can't quite budget, we want to have $54,000 in our operating fund. And that's 4 months worth of operating expenses, by the way. Therefore, ideally, we should have $127,000 in our fund balance today. Currently, we're a little bit low. We're at $105,000 or 83% of our ideal balance. Clearly, that sort of explanation would give someone a little more confidence than, well, we have to have enough for a rainy day. Or we need to have a bunch because we have a bunch to maintain. That isn't quite as fulfilling as what I just described. And then, what's the right assessment for our community? Well, our assessment's been set at $460, and that'll meet all of our operating, replacement, and capital goals that we were just describing earlier in the meeting. And it'll also help us get up to our ideal funding level, and we'll be there in 2 years. So we've calculated what the right assessment is for our community, and it's $460. So those right there are the questions, the answers, the science behind super budgeting. And I hope you found that this is really, really useful in planning the future of your particular community. I really appreciate all of you who've taken the time to participate in tonight's webcast. This will be posted probably as early as tomorrow on our website. So any of you who thought this was great and want your fellow board members to look at it, just send them to our website and they can take a look at this, along with all of the other ones. Our next seminar coming up in October, we're going to redo board member orientation. So if either you're a new board member or you have new board members, have them join that webcast. It's a great one. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.